Hello everyone, welcome. Are you ready? Sit back and get ready to listen. Today I'm going to tell you a story about some of the most horrific events in world history involving female slaves. Leave it to me drift off to sleep peacefully in the quiet of the night. First, subscribe to my channel, give it a like, and leave a comment telling me which country you're watching from. Introduction. The silenced half of history. Throughout the vast sweep of human civilization, slavery has been one of the most enduring and devastating institutions ever created by man. It has taken root on every continent, in every era, and across nearly every culture. But within this already brutal history, there exists a story even more deeply buried, even more deliberately erased: the story of enslaved women. They were not merely victims of the same system that consumed their male counterparts. They were targeted differently, used differently, broken differently. Their bodies were commodities in ways that men's bodies were not. Their suffering was compounded by gender in ways history has often chosen to overlook. This is their story. It is not a comfortable story. It is not a simple one. It spans thousands of years, dozens of civilizations, and countless individual lives, most of whose names we will never know. But it is a story that must be told, with honesty, with precision, and with the full weight of historical evidence behind every claim. Because to understand human history, we must understand what was done to the women who had no voice in it. We will travel from the ancient slave markets of Mesopotamia and Greece to the brutal plantations of the Caribbean and the American South. We will walk through the harems of the Ottoman Empire, the domestic slavery of medieval Europe, the transatlantic trade routes lined with human cargo, and the agricultural death camps of colonial Brazil. We will examine the legal codes that defined women as property, economic systems that made their exploitation profitable, and the social structures that made their silence mandatory. And in between the facts and the dates and the documented records, we will pause. Because behind every statistic there was a woman, a daughter, a mother, a person who woke up one morning in a world she recognized and went to sleep, or did not sleep at all, in a world that had decided she was not a person anymore. This is a work of historical narration grounded entirely in scholarly research. In what follows is invented or embellished. The horror speaks for itself. Part 1. The Ancient World. Slavery at Civilization's Dawn. Chapter 1. Mesopotamia and the First Slave Markets. The story of enslaved women begins almost as early as written history itself. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, in the great city-states of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, the first recorded slave systems emerged alongside the Fafertan laws, the first temples, and the first concentrated wealth. And from the very beginning, women occupied a particular and especially vulnerable position within those systems. The earliest cuneiforms from ancient Sumer, dating to around 500 BCE, already record the buying and selling of human beings. Among the most commonly traded were women and girls, who appeared in temple records as weavers, grinders, and domestic workers. The Sumerian word for female slave, munasarad, appears with striking frequency in administrative texts, indicating that enslaved women were central to the economic functioning of Mesopotamian society from its earliest documented moments. In the great ziggurat complexes, the towering temple structures that dominated Sumerian cities, thousands of enslaved women and girls were put to work in organized labor gangs. They wove textiles, ground grain, and produced the surplus goods that fueled urban economies. The Year 3 period, roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE, has yielded some of the most detailed administrative records of ancient slavery ever discovered. Tablets from the city gash describe workforces of hundreds of enslaved and organized into groups of 10, each overseen by a supervisor. These women received rations measured precisely in grams of barley, oil, and wool that were calculated to keep them alive and working, nothing more. What the tablets do not record in explicit detail, but what the broader legal codes make unmistakably clear, is the sexual dimension of their enslavement. The famous Code of Hammurabi, established in Babylon around 754 BCE, contains numerous provisions regarding enslaved women that reveal the full scope of their exploitation. A slave woman could be taken as a concubine by her master. Her children, if fathered by the master, occupied a complex legal status, sometimes free, sometimes not, depending entirely on whether the master chose to acknowledge them. If he did not, they remained enslaved. The woman herself had no legal recourse. She could not refuse. She could not complain. The law did not recognize her suffering as a wrong. The Babylonian legal system also addressed what happened when a free man purchased a woman as a slave with the explicit intention of making her a concubine. This practice was so common, so normalized, that lawmakers saw no need to prohibit it, only to regulate it. The law was concerned with property rights, with the competing claims of wives and concubines, with inheritance. The woman at the center of these transactions, her feelings, her body, her humanity, was entirely beside the point. Women became enslaved in Mesopotamia through several routes. Warfare was the primary source. When armies conquered cities, the defeated population was divided. Men were often killed or put to work in dangerous labor, while women and children were marched back to the victorious city as slaves. The records of the Assyrian Empire, which dominated much of the Near East from roughly 900 to centered 12 BCE, are particularly explicit about this practice. Royal annals proudly describe the deportation of thousands of women after military victories. One inscription from the reign of Sennacherib, who ruled Assyria from 705 to 691 BCE, describes the capture of over 200,000 people following his campaigns in Judah, women and girls among them, dragged from their homes to serve in Assyrian households and palaces. Debt slavery was another common route into bondage. In ancient Mesopotamia, when a family could not repay its debts, it could offer its members, daughters, wives second, as debt slaves to the creditor. The girl or woman would work in the creditor's household until the debt was considered repaid, which could mean years or a lifetime. Shamefully, there was no guaranteed endpoint. Debt slavery and permanent slavery existed on a continuum, and the line between them was often erased by time and circumstance. The Neo-Assyrian Empire maintained elaborate palace complexes in which enslaved women performed both domestic and sexual labor on a massive scale. The palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud housed hundreds of women described in administrative texts as palace women, category that encompassed everything from skilled weavers and musicians to sexual companions for the king and his nobles. These women were acquired tribute demands, military conquest, and direct purchase. They lived in carefully controlled quarters, supervised by eunuchs, denied any contact with the outside world, and entirely subject to the will of the palace administration. When the Assyrian Empire fell to the combined forces of the Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE, the great city of Nineveh was destroyed. What happened to the thousands of enslaved women in its palaces is not recorded. History, as it so often does, falls silent on the fate of those who were most vulnerable. Chapter 2. Egypt. The Nile's hidden Burgundian Egypt is often presented to the modern world through its monuments, the pyramids, the temples, the gilded tombs of its pharaohs. Less discussed is the labor force that built and sustained this civilization. A labor force that included, from the earliest periods of Egyptian history, enslaved women. Egyptian slavery is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. partly be because the Egyptians used different terminology for different categories of unfree labor, and partly because the records are uneven. But the evidence for the enslavement of women is clear and consistent. Egyptian sources from as early as the Old Kingdom period, around 700 to 200 BCE, record women in temple and estate workforces who were owned rather than employed. By the New Kingdom period, from roughly 550 to 270 BCE, slavery had become more formalized and more extensive, driven largely by Egypt's increasing military power and its capture of prisoners from Nubia, the Levant, Libya, and elsewhere. The story of enslaved women in Egypt is inseparable from the story of Egypt's wars. After successful military campaigns, captured women were distributed among the victorious generals, officials, and temples. Papyrus records from the reign of Ramesses II, who ruled from approximately 79 to 213 BCE, describe the distribution and Nubian women captured in battle. They were assigned to work in temple weaving workshops, in estate households, and in the domestic service of Egypt's elite. Their children were born into slavery. Their lives were entirely controlled by their owners. The erotic papyri of ancient Egypt, some of the oldest surviving records of human sexuality, provide another window, deeply uncomfortable, into the lives of enslaved women. Some scholars have interpreted certain scenes in these documents as depicting sexual violence against enslaved women, normalized within the social context to the point that it could be illustrated without apparent shame or censure. The story of the Hebrews in Egypt, whether historical or partly legendary, preserves the memory of a specific kind of mass enslavement, the forced labor of an entire people, men and women alike, in large-scale construction projects. The women in this narrative are not explicitly described in the construction labor, but appear prominently in the story of the Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah, who defied Pharaoh's order to kill male Hebrew infants. This episode, preserved in the Book of Exodus, reflects the real historical reality that enslaved women were expected to ply absolutely with their masters' demands, and that resistance, when it came, required extraordinary courage and carried extraordinary risk. Chapter 3: Ancient Greece. The civilization that made slavery beautiful. No civilization in Western history has been more celebrated for its contributions to human thought than ancient Greece. Democracy, philosophy, mathematics, tragedy, comedy, history as a discipline. Greece gave birth to all of these. It also gave birth to one of the most thoroughly developed slave societies in the ancient world, one in which enslaved women occupied a position of particular and multifaceted exploitation. Athens in its classical period, roughly the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, was as a society that celebrated freedom as its highest value, but defined freedom in the most exclusive possible terms. Freedom meant citizen men. Women, even free Athenian women, were severely constrained in their rights and movements. Enslaved women existed at the very bottom of a hierarchy that placed them beneath even free foreign women, who were themselves beneath citizen women. Enslaved women in Athens performed domestic labor in households across the social spectrum. They cooked, cleaned, carded wool, wove cloth, and cared for children. In wealthy households, multiple enslaved women might specialize in different tasks. In poorer households, a single enslaved woman might do everything. They had no legal standing, no right to family or marriage, no right to refuse any demand placed upon them. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women in ancient Greece was systematic and openly discussed in Greek literature and legal texts. Male owners had unrestricted sexual access to their enslaved women, and this was not considered a crime or even a wrong. The philosopher Demosthenes, in a famous speech from around 340 BCE, distinguished between three categories of women that Athenian men might maintain: wives for legitimate children, concubines for datum comfort, and courtesans for pleasure. The concubines in this formulation were typically enslaved women who had no choice in the arrangement. Particularly significant was the instapornai, enslaved women who were forced to work in brothels. Athens had a substantial commercial sex industry, and enslaved women were its foundation. The most famous Athenian brothel district was located near the Piraeus, Athens port. Enslaved women there were purchased by brothel owners, often called pornobaskoi, and forced to provide sole services to clients. The income they generated belonged entirely to their owners. They received nothing, not freedom, not wages, not protection from violence. The philosopher Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, provided an explicit philosophical justification for slavery in his work Politics, written in the 4th century BCE. He argued that some people were slaves by nature, that they lacked the rational capacity to govern themselves and were therefore suited, by their very nature, to be owned and directed by others. This argument applied to women as well as to enslaved people, and in Aristotle's framework, enslaved occupied a doubly inferior position. The Spartan treatment of enslaved women deserves special attention because it differed significantly from the Athenian model. Sparta's enslaved population, known as the Helots, were not individual property, but were essentially state-owned serfs bound to the land. They were Messenians, conquered by Sparta in a series of wars in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Helot women worked the land alongside Helot men, and both were subject to periodic campaigns of terror organized by the Spartan state, including the Cryptia, an institution in which young Spartan warriors were sent out at night to kill Helots, partly as military training and partly as a mechanism of social control. The violence against Helot women during these campaigns was not documented in explicit terms, but is implied in ancient sources that describe the Helots' state of constant fear and degradation. The treatment of enslaved women was so normalized in Greece that it appears in the most celebrated works of Greek literature, without comment or criticism. In Homer's Iliad, the enslaved Trojan women who become the property of victorious Greek warriors are simply part of the spoils of war, their grief acknowledged, but their enslavement unquestioned. Briseis, the enslaved woman whose seizure by Agamemnon from Achilles drives the plot of the Iliad, is treated as a prize, an object of which two powerful men quarrel. Her own feelings are glimpsed briefly in a lamentation over the death of Patroclus, but they play no role in the larger story. She is property, and the Iliad's world accepts this without apparent discomfort. The philosopher Plato in his dialogue occasionally voices discomfort with certain aspects of Athenian slave society, but he does not challenge the institution itself. The Republic, his vision of the ideal state, presupposes the existence of slavery. Like virtually every Greek thinker of his era, Plato could not imagine civilization without enslaved labor. The women who provided that labor, simply absent from the philosophical conversation about justice and the good life, invisible, as they were in so much of the historical record. Part 2.0, Rome and the Mediterranean World, Chapter 4. The Roman Empire, slavery as the foundation of civilization. If ancient Greece developed the philosophy of slavery, ancient Rome perfected its practice. At the height of the Roman Empire, enslaved people may have constituted between 25 and 40% of the population of Italy, making Rome one of the most slave-dependent societies in human history. Among this vast enslaved population, women occupied every level of the economic and social hierarchy, from field laborers in the brutal latifundia states of Sicily and southern Italy to personal attendants in the most luxurious households of the Roman elite. Roman law defined an enslaved person as a res, a thing. This was not a metaphor or a rhetorical device. It was a legal category with precise implications. An enslaved woman could not own property, could not enter into a legal contract, could not testify in court except under torture, could not marry, because Roman law recognized no slave marriages, and had no legal protection against sexual violence. A master who raped an enslaved woman committed no crime. A man who raped another man's enslaved woman had committed a crime, but that crime was property damage, not assault. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women in Rome was so deeply embedded in the culture that Roman writers discuss it with casual frankness. The agricultural writer Columella, writing in the 1st century CE, recommends that farm overseers, themselves often enslaved men, be rewarded for good work with enslaved women as concubines, in order to encourage them to have children who would increase the slave population and thus the master's wealth. He describes this arrangement in the same matter-of-fact tone he uses to discuss the breeding of livestock. The Roman agricultural system depended heavily on enslaved women's labor. On the great estates, women worked alongside men in harvesting, processing, and domestic production. They were also used in what one Roman source describes as the most exhausting form of agricultural labor, milling grain by hand, an endless, muscle-destroying task that required heavy millstones for hours at a time. Milling was sometimes used as a punishment, a way to break rebellious enslaved people of either sex. In urban households, enslaved women performed a vast range of domestic tasks. The households of wealthy Romans might include enslaved women who served as hairdressers, weavers, cooks, educators for children, readers, secretaries, and personal attendants. The very wealthy might own dozens of enslaved women, each with a designated specialty. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, describes with apparent distaste the practice of wealthy Romans keeping enormous numbers of enslaved people as status symbols. But he does not challenge the institution itself. The Roman brothel system, like its Greek successor, was built almost entirely on the labor of enslaved women. Roman towns and cities had licensed brothels, lupanaria, and the enslaved women who worked in them lived in conditions of extraordinary degradation. Pompeii, the Roman city preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, has yielded some of the most direct physical evidence of this system. The lupanare of Pompeii, the city's main brothel, contains small cubicles where enslaved women serviced clients on stone beds. The prices charged for their services, ranging from 2 to 16 asses, are preserved in graffiti on the walls. The names of some of the women are also preserved in graffiti, sometimes by clients, sometimes poignantly, apparently, by the women themselves. Some of these women were not just enslaved but were girls. Roman sources suggest that enslaved girls as young as 12 or 13 were commonly sold into brothels, their youth advertised as a selling point. The Roman legal category of infamia, legal disgrace, with associated loss of certain rights, applied to prostitutes automatically, which created a perverse situation in which the enslaved women forced into prostitution were then further degraded by the legal consequences of the work imposed on them. The Roman Empire's wars created a constant stream of newly enslaved women from across the known world. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars in the 1st century BCE reportedly resulted in the enslavement of over 1 million people. Many of these were women and children. When Caesar's legions sacked the Gallic city of Avaricum in 52 TEE, own account records that virtually the entire population, approximately 40,000 in people, was killed or enslaved. Women who survived such events were marched to the nearest Roman slave market and sold to the dealers who would transport them across the empire. The slave markets of Rome, particularly the Forum Boreum and later the Sapta Julia, were among the busiest commercial spaces in the ancient world. Enslaved people were displayed on rotating platforms, their physical condition assessed buyers as a farmer might assess livestock. For women, this assessment was explicitly sexual as well as physical. Roman legal sources confirmed that female slaves could be returned to dealers they were found to be defective in ways the buyer had not been warned about, including having had children, having experienced sexual violence, or having experienced venereal disease. The buyer's right to examine women before purchase was legally protected. The Stoic philosopher Cetus, who lived from approximately 50 to 135 CE and had himself been born into slavery, wrote with rare directness about the condition of enslaved people. He noted that enslaved men faced the threat of beatings and chains, while enslaved women faced the additional threat of sexual violence, a threat so constant that it shaped every aspect of their existence. His writings preserve, however briefly, an acknowledgement that the suffering of enslaved women had a particular character that the suffering of enslaved men did not. Among the most celebrated and most instructive stories of enslaved women in Rome is that of Virginia. In this Roman historical legend, preserved by the historian Livy, a Roman plebeian girl named Virginia is falsely claimed as a slave by a corrupt aristocrat named Appius Claudius, who desires her. Her father, to save her from sexual slavery and dishonor, kills her himself. And this act of desperation triggers a popular uprising that leads to significant political reforms. The story is remarkable not because it describes the typical experience of enslaved women, it does not, but because of what it reveals about Roman assumptions. In the Roman moral imagination, death was preferable to the sexual degradation that enslaved women routinely endured. The horror was not that such degradation occurred, it occurred constantly, but that it might happen to a free Roman girl. The suffering of actual enslaved women was simply the background noise against which the story of Virginia's tragedy played. Chapter 5: Carthage, North Africa, and the Hellenistic world. While Rome dominated the Western Mediterranean, the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the conquests of Alexander the Great created another vast zone of slave-dependent civilization across the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East. Egypt. In all of these kingdoms, the Palmyne Empire in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Persia, the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia, enslaved women were present in large numbers, performing both domestic and sexual labor. Carthage, the great Phoenician city of North Africa that was Rome's most formidable rival until its destruction in 146 BCE, maintained a slave system that drew on the peoples of the Western Mediterranean, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Carthaginian sources are sparse. The Romans destroyed the city so thoroughly that almost no Carthaginian literature survived. But what we know from external sources suggests that enslaved women in Carthage performed agricultural labor in North African estates and domestic work in urban households. The destruction of Carthage by Roman 146 BCE resulted in the enslavement of the city's entire Seraphi population, estimated at somewhere be 50,000 and 150,000 people. The women among them were distributed among Roman soldiers and officials or marched to the slave markets of Sicily and Italy. This single event illustrates, on a massive scale, the mechanism by which wars created enslaved populations. The conquered city becomes a source of human inventory, and women are among the primary commodities extracted. In Palmyne, Egypt, which was ruled by a Greek dynasty descended from one of Alexander's generals, a sophisticated papyrus record system has preserved remarkable detail about the lives of enslaved women. contracts for the purchase of enslaved women surviving quantity, listing the woman's name, age, and physical description. Some of these documents also record the purpose of the purchase, sometimes euphemistically, sometimes explicitly. A woman described as suitable for household work might be genuinely purchased for domestic labor. A woman described in more physical terms, height, complexion, absence of blemishes, was almost certainly being purchased for sexual purposes. The Palnik system also produced what may be the most extensive surviving ancient record of a slave market, the Xenon Papyri, a collection of documents from the estate of an official named Apollonius in the 3rd century BCE. These papyri reveal the mechanics of an ancient slave trading operation in extraordinary detail, including the prices paid for women of different ages and origins, the transportation routes used, and the conditions of enslaved people during transit. Part 3. The Medieval World and the Islamic Slave Trade. Chapter 6. The Arab Slave Trade, 1,000 years of human commerce. One of the most extensive and long-lasting stems of slavery in human history was the Arab slave trade, which operated continuously from approximately the 7th century until into 20th century. At its height, this system reached from West Africa across the Sahara, down the East African coast, across the Indian Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula and Persian Gulf, and in the great cities of the Middle East and Central Asia. It was a trade that, over its long history, may have transported somewhere between 10 and 15 million people into slavery, a number comparable to the transatlantic slave trade, and women were at its commercial center. The Islamic world's relationship with slavery is historically complex and theologically nuanced in ways that require careful treatment. Islamic law, as developed by scholars over the centuries, recognized slavery as a legal institution, while also establishing certain protections for enslaved people. The Quran addressed slavery without prohibiting it, though it encouraged the freeing of enslaved people as an act of religious merit. In practice, the gap between legal ideal and soul reality was vast, and enslaved women bore the brunt of that gap. The category of enslaved women most specifically targeted by the Arab trade was the concubine. Islamic law permitted a Muslim man to have sexual relations with enslaved women he owned, up to any number, in addition to his maximum of 4 legal wives. This provision, derived from Quranic interpretation and the practices of the early Islamic community, created an enormous demand for enslaved women across the Islamic world. Enslaved concubines were not merely objects of desire but markers of status, signs of wealth, and in some circumstances, paths to social and political influence, though only at enormous personal cost and through the complete absence of personal freedom. The women who entered this system came from an extraordinary range of geographic origins. From West Africa came women of the Saharan trade routes, Haza, Wolof, and many others, marched across the Sahara in caravans that were death marches as much as commercial expeditions. From East Africa came women of the Swahili coast and the African interior, Bantu-speaking peoples from what is now Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Congo, transported across the Indian Ocean and housed to the slave markets of Oman, Yemen, and the Persian Gulf. From southern Europe and Central Asia came Slavic, Greek, Armenian, and Georgian women, captured in raids or sold by desperate or predatory intermediaries into the markets of the Arab world. From Central Asia came Turkish and Circassian women, the latter so prized for their physical appearance that the Circassian slave trade became one of the most specialized and lucrative in the Antiamic world. The overland routes of the Saharan trade were among the most lethal in human history. Women and men marched together across hundreds of miles of desert, in columns that could number in the hundreds. They were given minimal water and food. Those who could not keep pace were left to die in the sand. Arab and Berber traders who made this crossing regularly kept meticulous records of their goods, including the expected death rates of enslaved people in transit, which they factored into their commercial calculations like any other business expense. Contemporary accounts from medieval Arab geographers describe the Sahara routes as lined with human bones. The East African trade, which intensified particularly from the 9th century onward, followed a different geography but was equally brutal. Slave raiders, sometimes Arab or Swahili, sometimes African intermediaries working for the trade, struck inland communities along the Zambezi and Congo river systems, attacking villages at night and marching survivors to the coast. The journey from the interior to the coastal ports could take weeks or months. Many died before reaching the dhows that would carry them across the ocean. Those who survived the ocean crossing arrived in the Arabian Peninsula in a state of profound physical and psychological devastation. The great slave markets of the Arab world, in Mecca, Medina, Baghdad, Cairo, and Zanzibar, were enormous commercial enterprises. In Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate, which reached its peak in the 8th and 9th centuries CE, the slave markets were among the largest and most specialized in the world. Women were displayed and sold separately from men, examined physically by prospective buyers, and priced according to a complex system that valued physical beauty, youth, musical or poetic accomplishment, and virgin status. The most prized enslaved women, young, beautiful, musically talented, and sexually inexperienced, could command prices equivalent to years of wages for an ordinary craftsman. The institution of the harem, an Arabic and later Turkish term referring to the private female quarters of a Muslim household, has been romanticized in Western popular culture to a degree that bears no relationship to the historical reality for most of the women within it. In the harems of the great Islamic empires, enslaved women lived under conditions of total control. They could not leave without permission. They could not receive visitors without supervision. Their bodies were available to the master of the household on demand. Their children, if fathered by the master, might be freed and recognized, or might not be, depending entirely on the master's choice. The harem of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, the largest and most famous of the medieval Islamic world, contained, at its height, thousands of women. The 10th century historian al-Tabari describes the household of the Caliph al-Mutawakkil as including over 4,000 concubines. The logistics of maintaining such a system, feeding, housing, administering, and controlling thousands of enslaved women, required an elaborate bureaucracy, supervised by enslaved eunuchs who served as the intermediaries between the women's quarters and the male world outside. Within the harem, the social hierarchy was fierce and complex. Women competed for the caliph's or sultan's attention, knowing that bearing a son might transform their status from slave to al-Walid, mother of the master's child, a legally protected category that prevented her from being sold and gave her son legitimate status. This transformation was the only path to any form of security, and it depended entirely on the master's sexual choices, over which the woman had no control. Some enslaved women within this system achieved remarkable influence. The figure of the Kayyan enslaved women trained in music, poetry, and intellectual conversation occupies a fascinating and troubling place in Islamic cultural history. The Kayyan of the Abbasid period were among the most accomplished women in the medieval world, schooled in Arabic literature, music theory, and the art of witty conversation. Their performances at elite gatherings were celebrated by the greatest poets of the age. They were admired, desired, and occasionally treated as almost equal intellectual partners by the men who owned them. But admiration was not freedom. No matter how celebrated a Cana, the singular form, Erdi, she could be sold if her owner wished. She could be given as a gift. She had no right to refuse the sexual demands of her owner, or in some circumstances, his guests. The cultural celebration of the Cayenne was, in a profound sense, a celebration of the slave system that had produced them, a system that took women by force, trained them for the pleasure of men, and then admired the result as a cultural achievement. Chapter 7: Slavery in the Byzantine Empire and Medieval Europe. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, maintained a slave system throughout its existence, from the 4th century CE until its fall in 453. Byzantine slavery differed somewhat from its Roman predecessor. It was less central to agricultural production and more concentrated in urban households and the imperial palace. But for enslaved women, the fundamental conditions of their bondage, the absence of legal personhood, the availability of their bodies to their owners, the impossibility of family or self-determination, remained unchanged. Byzantine law, on Roman legal foundations, defined enslaved people as property while also providing some theoretical protections. The Justinianic Code of the 6th century CE, the great legal compilation that shaped European law for centuries, acknowledged certain limits on the treatment of enslaved people. Masters could not kill them arbitrarily, for instance, while fully preserving the institution of slavery itself. In practice, the distance between legal theory and lived reality was enormous. The primary source of enslaved people in the Byzantine Empire was warfare, particularly against the neighboring peoples of the steppes, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Slavic peoples, whose very name became the etymological root of the word slave in most European languages, were among the most commonly enslaved groups in the Byzantine world. The irony is grim and instructive. The Slavic peoples of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, who were themselves often the Dieftum Sintini or Arab slave raiding, also sometimes participated in the trade as suppliers, selling captured enemies or, in times of desperation, their own community members. The word slave itself is a linguistic monument to the suffering of Slavic women and men. In the 9th century CE, the great slave trading networks of Central Europe supplied enormous numbers of enslaved people, predominantly Slavic, to both the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. The most important of these routes ran through the Frankish Empire, where Jewish Arab merchants organized the transit of enslaved people from the Slavic frontier to Mediterranean markets. And Slavic women, transported along these routes, entered harems from Baghdad to Cordoba. In medieval Western Europe, the picture of slavery is more complicated. The institution that had powered the Roman economy never entirely disappeared, but it gradually transformed, partly under the influence of Christian theology, which created moral unease about the enslavement of fellow Christians, and partly due to economic changes, into serfdom, a system of unfree labor that bound people to the land rather than to individual owners. Serfs were not legally slaves in the Roman sense, but their freedom was severely constrained. They could not leave the land without their lord's permission, they owed labor and payment to their lord, and they had limited legal recourse against mistreatment. For women who were serfs, the conditions of their bondage were compounded by gender. The lord's right of prime noctis, first night, is a controversial historical concept disputed by some scholars, but that the virility of sexual vulnerability that it symbolizes is not in dispute. Unfree women in medieval European society had limited protection against sexual exploitation by their lords or overseers. The records of medieval manorial courts contain scattered evidence of sexual violence against serf women. though the documentation is inevitably incomplete because such violence was rarely prosecuted. Outright chattel slavery, in the Roman sense, persisted in medieval Europe longer and more extensively than is often acknowledged. In the Carolingian Empire, slavery was widespread. Enslaved people were given as gifts between nobles and as payments to the church. Enslaved women appear in Carolingian records performing domestic labor in estates and monasteries. The church itself owned enslaved people, a fact that created theological discomfort that was resolved, unsatisfyingly, by distinguishing between the slavery of the body, which the church accepted, and the freedom of the soul, which Christianity promised to all. The Viking Age, which began in the late 8th century and continued through the 11th, introduced a new wave of slave raiding into Western Europe. Viking warriors conducted raids along the coasts of Ireland, France, and Spain, carrying off captives, men, women, and children, to sell in the slave markets of Scandinavia and beyond. Irish and English women captured in Viking raids appear in the sagas as thralls, the Old Norse term for enslaved people. Some were kept in Scandinavia, others were transported east, along the great river routes of Russia, to the slave markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. The slave market at Hedabai, a major Viking trading center in what is now northern Germany, was one of the largest in northern Europe. Arab traveler Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, visiting in the 10th century, described the market with particular attention to the enslaved women sold there. His account, though brief, is one of the rare contemporary descriptions of a northern European slave market, and it makes clear that the buying and selling of women was a central commercial activity. The Crusades, which began in 1296 and continued intermittently for nearly 2 centuries, created new waves of enslavement on both sides of the conflict. When Crusader forces captured Jerusalem in 1099, the massacre and enslavement of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants was extensive. When Muslim forces under Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, the mass enslavement of Christian women was prevented, famously, by Saladin's decision to allow them to be ransomed. But in other theaters of the crusading wars, the enslavement of women was a routine consequence of military victory. The slave markets of the Crusader states, particularly Acre and Antioch, traded in both Muslim and Christian women, demonstrating that religious identity was, in practice, a secondary consideration when commercial profit was at stake. Part 4. The Ottoman Empire and the Caucasian slave trade, Chapter 8. The Ottoman harem, power, bondage, and the architecture of control. The Ottoman Empire, which at its height controlled territories stretching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf and from the Crimea to North Africa, maintained one of the most elaborate slave systems in world history. Between roughly 1550 and 900 CE, the Ottomans imported millions of enslaved people, overwhelmingly from sub-Saharan Africa and the Caucasus, and the enslaved women among them occupied a unique and carefully stratified position within Ottoman society. The Ottoman imperial harem, the Harem-i Humayun within the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, was the largest, most powerful, and most carefully documented institution of its kind in world history. At its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, the imperial harem housed hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 women. Enslaved concubines, their attendants, the mothers and daughters of sultans, and the enslaved women who served them all. This vast institution consumed enormous resources, required a large administrative staff, and exercised, through the women within it, genuine political power over the greatest empire of the era. The enslaved women who entered the imperial harem, called Kari in Ottoman Turkish, came primarily from 2 regions, the Caucasus and sub-Saharan Africa. Circassian women from the Caucasian mountain region that is today part of Russia were the most prized for the Ottoman harem. The Circassians had developed, over centuries, a practice of selling their daughters into the Ottoman slave trade, partly under economic compulsion, partly because entrance into the imperial harem offered, in theory, a path to status and influence unavailable through any other route. Circassian women were celebrated in the Ottoman aesthetic for their fair complexion and physical beauty, and they commanded the highest prices in the slave markets of Constantinople. The process by which a young Circassian girl became a Curie in the imperial harem was brutal in its own way, even before she arrived at the palace. She was typically sold by her family between the ages of 5 and 12, young enough to be trained, young enough to forget, or at least partially forget, her origins. She passed through the hands of slave merchants, traveled overland to the Black Sea coast, crossed the sea to Constantinople, and arrived in the slave market of Galata to be examined, priced, and sold. If she was beautiful and young enough to attract the notice of the palace agents who came to market for the Sultan's household, she would be purchased for the harem. If not, she might enter a private household. Within the harem, the Curie who had been selected for the imperial hold began a long period of training. She learned Ottoman Turkish, Islamic prayer and practice, music, embroidery, and the complex etiquette of the palace. She was assigned to serve senior women of the harem, the Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, who was the most powerful woman in the empire, or the Sultan's favorite consorts. She might spend years in this service or ever meeting the Sultan himself. If she never attracted his attention, she might serve the entire duration of her bondage with ever becoming a concubine, eventually being married off to an Ottoman official and freed, technically, though freedom in such circumstances was a complex and constrained condition. If she did attract the Sultan's attention, and he chose to have sexual relations with her, she became a Seki, a consort. If she bore him a son, she achieved the status of Haseki Sultan, one of the most powerful positions available to a woman in the Ottoman world. The Valide Sultan, the mother of a ruling sultan, was effectively the most powerful person in the empire after the Sultan himself. She controlled the harem's enormous wealth, influenced appointments and policy, and received foreign ambassadors. This path from enslaved child to imperial power broker is one of the most extraordinary social trajectories in world history, and it has led some observers to view the Ottoman harem system with a degree of admiration or at least ambivalence. This view deserves serious challenge. The women who achieved power within the harem system did so by surviving an institution that destroyed the vast majority of those who passed through it. For every harem sultan, the enslaved woman of probable Ruthenian origin who became the legal wife of Solyman the Magnificent in the 16th century. The most spectacular six-story the harem system produced, there were hundreds of women who lived and died in bondage, their names unrecorded, their suffering unacknowledged. The African women who entered the Ottoman slave system occupied a different, and even more constrained position than their Circassian counterparts. Enslaved women from sub-Saharan Africa, primarily from what is now Ethiopia, Sudan, and the East African coast, were channeled into Ottoman households in large numbers, but rarely into the imperial harem itself, where racial preference for lighter-skinned women from the Caucasus was explicit. African women in Ottoman society served as domestic workers, nursemaids, and in the lower levels of household service. They were less visible in the historical record, less celebrated in the literature, and less documented in the archives. A reflection not of their scarcity, but of their low status within a system that stratified women by race as well as by rank. Chapter 9. The Circassian Slave Trade. Beauty as commodity, the Circassian slave trade occupies a unique and deeply troubling place in the history of enslaved women, because it involved a community's deliberate participation in the sale of its own daughters. Understanding this participation requires careful attention to the desperate circumstances that produced it, and an insistence that circumstance does not dissolve responsibility or erase the suffering of the women and girls involved. Circassia, the mountainous region of the northwestern Caucasus, was a collection of tribal communities that had maintained independence through centuries of warfare with their neighbors. By the early 19th century, they faced existential pressure from Russian imperial expansion, which sought to bring the Caucasus under Russian control. The Russo-Circassian War, which lasted from 1760 to 1864, ended in a catastrophic defeat for the Circassians and a genocide, recognized as such by several modern governments, in which the Russian army killed, displaced, and destroyed the Circassian people on a massive scale. Between 600,000 and 1.5 million Circassians died or were expelled from their homeland. In this context of existential pressure, the sale of Circassian daughters to Ottoman Sultans was sometimes framed by the Circassians themselves and by later observers as a form of survival strategy. Families secured payment that allowed them to survive another winter while there. Daughters gained entry to the Ottoman world, which offered the theoretical possibility of freedom, marriage, and even power. This framing, while not entirely false, is deeply inadequate. Girls as young as 5 were sold. They had no voice in the transaction. Opportunity offered by the harem was available only at the cost of everything a person might otherwise have been. The Circassian slave trade peaked in the first half of the 19th century, when the combination of Russian military pressure and Ottoman demand created conditions of extraordinary commercial intensity. Travelers who visited the slave markets of Constantinople during this period left vivid and disturbing accounts of Circassian women and girls displayed for sale, their physical examination by prospective buyers, the prices agreed upon, the expressions on their faces. An American journalist named J.L. Farley, visiting Constantinople in the 1850s, described a slave market in terms that make clear the dehumanizing mechanics of the commercial transaction, even as his account reflects the Orientalist prejudices of his era. The abolition of the Circassian slave trade was an extended and contested process. The Ottoman Empire formally abolished the slave trade in 1857 under British diplomatic pressure, but the trade continued clandestinely for decades afterward. Women from the Caucasus continued to arrive in Ottoman harems well into the late 19th and early 20th centuries through mechanisms that were technically illegal but practically unchallenged. The last documented sale of a Circassian woman into the Ottoman palace system occurred in the early 20th century, within living memory of people who were still alive when the research for this account was conducted. Part 5, The Transatlantic Slave Trade and the Americas, Chapter 10. The Middle Passage. The gendered horror of the ocean crossing, the transatlantic slave trade, stands as one of the greatest crimes in human history. A systematic, deliberate, commercially organized theft of human beings from their continent, their families, and their futures, conducted over 4 centuries and resulting in the forced transportation of somewhere between 10 and 12.5 million people from Africa to the Americas. Within this immense catastrophe, the experience of women and girls, estimated to constitute roughly 40% of enslaved people transported across the Atlantic, had features that were distinct, additional, and require specific examination. The ships that crossed the Atlantic with their enslaved human cargo were designed with the minimum possible concern for the survival let alone the comfort, of the people inside them. Men were typically chained together in the lower decks, in spaces so constricted that they could not sit upright. Women and older children were usually kept in a separate section, nominally less confined. But this separation carried its own particular horror. The separation of women from the main mass of chained men gave the ship's crew direct and easy access to them. What happened to enslaved women during the Middle Passage, the ocean crossing from Africa to the Americas, is documented in the accounts of survivors, in the testimony of British sailors before parliamentary committees investigating the slave trade in the late 18th century, and in the records of ship captains and surgeons. The sexual violence was systematic. Women who resisted were beaten. Women who submitted were not protected. The violence continued for the weeks or months that the crossing took. Olodaikiano, an African man who was enslaved as a child and who later published his remarkable autobiography in 789, described the Middle Passage with a power that no secondary account can replicate. He described the cries of the women and the groans of the dying, the stench below decks, the despair that drove some enslaved people to throw themselves into the sea rather than continue. His account, though written from a male perspective, acknowledges the specific terror experienced by enslaved women. The account of Venture Smith, an enslaved man of West African origin, describes the capture of his family in Africa and the separation that began the process of enslavement. His mother was seized along with him. He never saw her again after the ocean crossing. This separation, the tearing apart of families, the deliberate destruction of the bonds between mothers and children, was not accidental to the slave system. It was integral to it. A woman deprived of her child was easier to control. A child deprived of its mother was utterly dependent on the system that had captured it. The mortality rate on Middle Passage ships was horrific. Early in the trade's history, it averaged somewhere around 15 to 20% of the enslaved people on board. Even as conditions improved marginally over time, partly due regulation, partly due to slave traders' self-interest in keeping their merchandise alive, the crossing remained extraordinarily deadly. Dysentery, smallpox, dehydration, despair, and violence killed people in numbers that the traders simply factored into their business models. When ships arrived at their American destinations, in Brazil, in the Caribbean islands, in the ports of North America, the surviving enslaved people were subjected to another round of physical examination, display, and auction. For women, this process was once again compounded by sexual dimensions that men did not face. Their bodies were examined for signs of pregnancy and venereal disease. Their age, health, and physical appearance were assessed in terms that combined labor value with sexual desirability. They were sold, sometimes individually, sometimes in lots, to buyers who used them for agricultural labor, domestic work, or sexual exploitation, often all three simultaneously. Chapter 11, The Plantation System, Slavery in the American South, the Plantation System of the American South. The agricultural economy based on the forced labor of enslaved African Americans was one of the most thoroughly documented and thoroughly studied systems of slavery in world history. We know more about American plantation slavery than about almost any other slave system in history, because it was relatively recent, because it generated enormous quantities of records, and because the descendants of its survivors have preserved its memory with fierce determination. Within this well-documented system, the experience of enslaved women has a particular and essential dimension. Enslaved women in the American South performed the same brutal agricultural labor as enslaved men. They worked in the cotton fields of South Carolina and Georgia, in the tobacco fields of Virginia and North Carolina, in the sugar fields of Louisiana, from before dawn to after dark, under the supervision of overseers who used violence as their primary management tool. The whip was ubiquitous. Its use was legal. It was used on women as readily as on men, sometimes more so, when masters believed that whipping a woman's husband or child in front of her would compel her compliance more effectively than whipping her directly. The peculiar institution, as slaveholders euphemistically called American slavery, was also, for enslaved women, a system of reproductive exploitation. Because the importation of enslaved people from Africa was legally prohibited after 1888, the American slave system became dependent on natural population growth to maintain its labor force. This meant that enslaved women's reproductive capacity was of direct economic value to their owners. They were expected to have children who were born into slavery and who would eventually work in the fields themselves. The implications of this reproductive dimension were enormous and terrifying. Enslaved women had no right to refuse sexual contact with their masters, overseers, or any man their owners chose to direct their way. The rape of enslaved women by white men was not a crime in the American South. It was, in a profound and documented sense, policy. Planters and overseers fathered children by enslaved women routinely. The children were enslaved at birth, regardless of their parentage. The mothers had no legal recourse, no protection, and no escape. The testimony of enslaved women who survived to tell their stories is the most direct evidence we have of this reality. Harriet Jacobs, who published her narrative Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861, described with painful specificity the years-long sexual harassment she endured from her owner, Dr. James Norcom. She described how Norcom whispered obscenities in her ear while she nursed her children, how he followed her everywhere, how he threatened her with violence when she resisted. Her resistance, choosing to enter into a sexual relationship with another white man on her own terms, in order to deny Norcom access to her, was an act of extraordinary courage within a system that left her no good options. Her narrative, the most detailed account of sexual predation within American slavery left by a woman who survived it, was dismissed by many white readers as too explicit to be credible. It is, in fact, carefully restrained. The domestic work performed by enslaved women in plantation households, the cooking, cleaning, sewing, child care, and personal attendance on white women and children, brought them into constant proximity with white families in ways that created their own particular forms of trauma. Enslaved women who worked as house servants were never off duty. They were accessible at any hour. They were expected to smile, to be deferential, to make white people comfortable, while enduring treatment that ranged from condescension and casual cruelty to systematic violent sexual exploitation. The enslaved wet nurse occupies a particularly painful place in this history. Enslaved women who had just given birth were routinely required to nurse the babies of white women, sometimes at the expense of their own infants, who were given watered-down gruel, or the breast milk of other enslaved women while their mother's milk went to white children. The intimacy of this arrangement, the white infant at the breast of the enslaved woman, coexisted with the absolute legal and social inequality between them. It is one of the more revealing images of American slavery's fundamental contradiction. Frederick Douglass, in his narrative published in 1845, described watching his Aunt Hester beaten by their master with a violence so extreme and so clearly connected to the master's sexual jealousy. The master had ordered Hester not to see another enslaved man, and she had disobeyed. That it announced to the young Douglass what slavery meant. Not merely the absence of freedom, but the total ownership of one person's body by another, in every conceivable dimension. The internal slave trade, The buying and selling of enslaved people within the United States, which became increasingly important after the prohibition of the Atlantic trade, was itself a mechanism of terror for enslaved women and their families. Between 100 and 860, approximately 1 million enslaved people were transported from the older slave states of the Upper South to the newer plantation regions of the Deep South and the Gulf Coast. Children were separated from mothers, husbands from wives, siblings from siblings, in numbers that staggers comprehension. The slave markets of Richmond, Virginia, and New Orleans, Louisiana, were among the most active commercial centers in the antebellum United States. And the sight of enslaved women and children on the auction block was as common as any other commercial spectacle of the era. Solomon Northup, a free black man who was kidnapped and enslaved in 1841, described the New Orleans slave market in his memoir 12 Years a Slave with a specificity that has been confirmed by other sources. He described the separation of a woman named Eliza from her children in terms that leave no ambiguity about the emotional devastation involved. The children were sold separately. Eliza's grief was so complete and so uncontrollable that her buyers complained she was unsuitable because her weeping would disturb the household. Her loss was translated immediately into a market problem, a defect in the commodity. Chapter 12, Slavery in the Caribbean, Sugar, Death, and the Economics of Brutality. If the cotton fields of the American South represent one face of New World slavery, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean represent another, in some ways more extreme, in many ways more lethal. The sugar economy of the Caribbean was built on an equation of breathtaking cruelty. Sugar production, such extreme labor that it killed enslaved people faster than they could reproduce, making continuous importation from Africa not merely economically preferable but biologically necessary. The British island of Barbados, one of the first major sugar producers in the Caribbean, established a pattern that other islands replicated. By late 17th century, Barbados had a sugar monoculture that was among the most productive and most deadly agricultural systems ever created. Enslaved people were worked until they died, quite literally. Life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Barbados sugar plantation in the 17th century has been estimated by some historians at as low as 7 to 10 years from the moment of arrival. The planters did not invest in keeping their workforce alive, they invested in replacing it. Enslaved women on Caribbean sugar plantations performed the full range of brutal labor that the sugar cycle required. During planting season, they dug holes in the hard soil with heavy hoes, working in long lines called gangs, supervised by drivers who used whips to maintain pace. During harvest, they cut the cane with machetes in its heat, loaded it onto carts, and fed it into the processing mill. In the mill itself, the most dangerous part of the operation, women worked alongside men feeding cane into rollers. Accidents that resulted in the loss of an arm were common. The standard practice was to keep a machete nearby to amputate before a person was pulled entirely into the machinery. During crop season, which could last for months, enslaved people on sugar plantations sometimes worked around the clock, sleeping in shifts, tending the boiling houses where the sugar was processed in giant Keter vats. The heat was extreme. Burns were ubiquitous. The combination of overwork, malnutrition, disease, and violence produced mortality rates that shocked even some contemporary observers who were not otherwise troubled by the institution of slavery itself. In this environment of extreme mortality, enslaved women faced the additional burden of pregnancy and childbirth. The demographic records of Caribbean plantations show clearly that the mortality rate among enslaved infants was catastrophic. Women who were overworked, malnourished, and subjected to physical violence during pregnancy had high rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant mortality. Some historians have argued that some enslaved women deliberately induced abortions or infanticide as acts of resistance, denying the slave system future labor. Though the evidence is complex and the interpretation contested, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women on Caribbean plantations followed the same pattern as in the American South, but with some differences. The Caribbean planter class was, by American standards, somewhat more openly predatory, partly because Caribbean societies had a more diverse racial hierarchy, with distinct legal and social categories for people of mixed racial ancestry, and partly because the Caribbean colonies were less influenced by the evangelical Protestant movements that at least occasionally produced moral discomfort about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women in North America. Haiti, the French colony of Saint-Domingue that became the site of the only successful slave revolution in modern history, was the single most productive and most deadly sugar colony in the Caribbean at the end of the 18th century. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue numbered approximately 500,000 by 1789, against a free population of roughly 60,000. They were worked with a ferocity that made Saint-Domingue famous even among Caribbean planters for the intensity of its brutality. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and culminated independence in 1804, was a convulsion of violence and liberation that transformed the world. Enslaved women participated in the revolution in multiple roles: as fighters, as organizers, as suppliers of information, and as the domestic workers within planter households whose invisibility gave them access to information that was militarily valuable. Women like Saniette Belair, who fought alongside her husband in the revolutionary forces, were later executed by French forces with a deliberate brutality intended as a message. The courage of these women has been substantially underrepresented in historical accounts that focus on the male military leadership of the revolution. Chapter 13, Brazil. The largest slave society in the Americas. Brazil was the largest slave society in the Americas in terms of total numbers, receiving approximately 4.9 million enslaved Africans over the course of the transatlantic trade, nearly half of the total. The Brazilian slave system persisted until 1888, making Brazil the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. For enslaved women in Brazil, 4 centuries of bondage created a system of exploitation as extensive and as brutal as any in the Americas. The agricultural economy of colonial and imperial Brazil was built on a succession of export crops: first Brazilwood, then sugar, then gold, then cotton, then coffee, each of which demanded enormous quantities of enslaved labor. Like the Caribbean, the Brazilian sugar regions of the Northeast were areas of extreme mortality, requiring constant importation of new enslaved people from Africa to replace those who died from overwork, disease, and violence. Brazilian slave law, derived from the Portuguese legal tradition and influenced by the Roman civil law tradition, differed from North American slave law in several ways. Under Brazilian law, enslaved people had slightly more avenues to manumission, the legal process by which an enslaved person could be freed. A Brazilian enslaved woman could purchase her own freedom, or could be freed by an owner, or could be freed as a reward for long service. In practice, manumission was uncommon, and the existence of legal pathways to freedom did not make the experience of bondage less brutal for the vast majority of enslaved women who never achieved it. The coffee economy of southeastern Brazil, which dominated the 19th century, commanded a labor force of enormous size. The province of São Paulo, which became the center of coffee production in the 19th century, saw a massive increase in the enslaved population. The conditions on coffee fazendas, the great plantation estates, were somewhat less immediately lethal than on sugar plantations, but they were characterized by a different kind of brutality. Chronic overwork, system malnutrition, and violence used casually and constantly as a management tool. Enslaved women in Brazil performed both agricultural and domestic labor, and the domestic sphere was no less exploitative than the fields. The close contact between enslaved women and white households in Brazil created conditions for sexual exploitation that were, if anything, more pervasive than in the American South. The Brazilian myth of racial democracy, the idea that society was more harmonious and lessist than North American society because of its history of racial mixing, has been extensively critiqued by Brazilian historians who have shown that this racial mixing was the result of the systematic rape of enslaved women, not of romantic relationships between equals. The Quilombos, communities of escaped enslaved people who established themselves in the Brazilian interior, represent one of the most remarkable forms of resistance in the history of slavery. The largest and most famous of these, Palmares, which existed in the northeastern interior from roughly 1600 to 1694, housed a population estimated at between 11,000 and 30,000 people at its height. Women participated in the life of the Quilombos as founders, workers, and fighters. Some led communities. Some were military commanders. Their names are rarely recorded in the historical sources, which were or almost entirely written by their enemies. But the Quilombo communities themselves represent the collective agency of enslaved people who refused to accept the system that had captured them. Part 6. Asia and the Pacific, Chapter 2. Slavery in China, Concubinage, and domestic bondage. China's history of slavery spans thousands of years and encompasses a range of practices that evolved significantly from dynasty to dynasty. The experience of enslaved women in Chinese history is particularly significant because of the institution of concubinage, the taking of secondary wives or sexual companions, typically from lower social classes or through purchase, which created a distinct form of female bondage that intersected with, was not identical to chattel slavery. In ancient China, as documented in oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang dynasty, roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE, slavery was well established. Enslaved people were used in agriculture, construction, and household service, and enslaved women appear in the archaical record as both workers and ritual victims. Human sacrifice at royal burials sometimes included enslaved women, a practice that continued intermittently through several dynasties. The Zhou dynasty, which followed the Shang, established a more complex legal framework for slavery. Enslaved people were divided into various categories based on their origin and status, but the fundamental condition of legal property applied throughout. Enslaved women in Zhou China performed domestic labor in aristocratic households and served as concubines to elite men. The institution of concubinage was legally recognized and socially accepted. A wealthy man might have one official wife and multiple concubines who occupied a clearly defined but subordinate position in the household hierarchy. The Han Dynasty, which ruled from 206 BCE to 220 CE, represents one of the high points of Chinese classical civilization, and also one of the most thoroughly documented periods of female slavery in Chinese history. Han legal codes specified the rights and obligations of enslaved people, including enslaved women, with characteristic precision. An enslaved woman could be bought, sold, given as a gift, and inherited. She had no right to refuse her master's sexual demands. Her children belonged to her master. She could be freed by her master's decision, but not by her own. The practice of purchasing concubines continued throughout Chinese history and reached a particularly elaborate and formalized expression in the imperial harem system of the Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties. The Ming imperial hatting, established in the 14th century, housed thousands of women, selected through a nationwide examination process from among the daughters of commoner families, who were brought to the Forbidden City in Beijing and kept in permanent enclosure. Those who attracted the emperor's sexual attention became concubines. The majority served as attendants, musicians, or workers. A woman who entered the imperial harem and never attracted the emperor's attention might remain confined within the Forbidden City for the rest of her life, never returning to family, never marrying, never having children. The trafficking of women and girls within China was, by any measure, one of the largest and most continuous systems of female exploitation in world history. Poor families in rural areas sold daughters into domestic service, concubinage, or prostitution throughout Chinese history. The girls sold in this way were typically between 5 and 12 years old. They entered households as mujikai, little bondmaids, who were expected to work for no wages and to endure whatever treatment their owners chose to impose. The mucai system, a Cantonese term for the practice of selling girls into domestic servitude, persisted in southern China and in overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia well into the 20th century. British colonial authorities in Hong Kong attempted to abolish the system in the 1920s and 1930s. Success. The girls sold into the system were legally considered to be adopted daughters, which obscured the reality of their bondage under a veneer of family language. In practice, they were servants who could be resold, given away, or placed in brothels at their owner's discretion. Chapter 15: Japan, the Karaoke-san and the export of enslaved women. Japan's history with enslaved women takes on a particular form in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period when the country was undergoing modernization and integration into the global capitalist economy. The phenomenon of the Karaoke-san, Japanese women and girls who were trafficked abroad to work as sex slaves in the brothels of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and beyond, represents a distinctive episode in the history of female exploitation. The word Karaoke-san means, roughly, one who has gone to China, though in practice these women ended up in Borneo, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Hawaii, California, and throughout the emerging Japanese Empire. They came overwhelmingly from the impoverished rural regions of Kyushu, particularly from Nagasaki and Kumamoto prefectures, where, fambling with the economic disruptions of the Meiji period, sometimes sold daughters to brokers, called zijin, who promised employment abroad. The reality, uniformly, was forced prostitution. The Karaoke-san system operated through a network of brothels, sometimes called comfort houses, a term that would acquire its horrific meaning in the context of the Second World War, managed by Japanese entrepreneurs throughout Asia. The women who worked in these brothels were in debt bondage. They had been purchased from the families, and now owed that purchase price plus accumulated interest to the brothel owner. In theory, they could work off their debt and be free. In practice, the system of debt accounting ensured that most women never achieved freedom. Additional debts were added for clothing, food, housing, and medical treatment, keeping them perpetually indebted. The story of the Karaoke-san is connected directly to the far more widely known atrocity of the comfort women system established by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Second World War. The comfort women, a euphemism of grotesque inequity, were between 100,000 and 200,000 women, predominantly Korean but also including Chinese, Filipino, Dutch, and other nationalities who were forced into sexual slavery to serve as Japanese military personnel during the war. Some were recruited through false promises of factory or nursing work. Some were kidnapped directly. Many were sold by desperate families who did not understand what they were consenting to. The comfort women lived in military brothels, comfort stations, in conditions of extreme violence and degradation. They were required to service between 10 and 30 soldiers per day. They were beaten if they refused or resisted. They received no pay. They were moved from base to base as the military required. Many died from violence, disease, or suicide. Those who survived carried the physical and psychological consequences for the rest of their lives, and then faced social stigma in their home communities that punished them for having been victimized. The Japanese government's refusal to fully acknowledge this atrocity and its decades-long resistance to formal apology and compensation has made the comfort women system one of the most politically charged historical controversies in East Asia. The surviving women, hibakusha of a different kind, survivors of a different form of mass violence, organized and spoke out, beginning in the 1990s, in testimony that was both individually heartbreaking and historically indispensable. Chapter 16, India, Devadasis, Debt Bondage, and the Commodification of Sacred India's history of female slavery encompasses several distinct but interconnected systems, the most distinctive of which is the Devadasi institution, the dedication of women and girls to Hindu temples, theoretically as servants of the divine, in practice as providers of sexual services to priests, patrons, and upper caste men. The Devadasi tradition has ancient roots, with origins that scholars trace to the early medieval period, perhaps as far back as the 6th or 7th century CE. In its original form, it may have been a genuinely religious institution in which trained women performed ritual dance and music in temple precincts. Over time, however, through a complex process influenced by changes in temple patwana economic decline and the commodification of the women themselves, the institution became a system of sexual slavery disguised in sacred language. By the 19th century, when British colonial authorities began to examine the Devadasi system with critical attention, the typical Devadasi was a girl of lower caste background who had been dedicated to a temple by her family, sometimes under economic pressure, sometimes through genuine religious belief, sometimes through the coercion of local patrons who benefited from the system. Once dedicated, she was considered married to the deity, and therefore barred from ordinary marriage. She was trained in music and dance, and she performed these arts in temple contexts. She was also expected to provide sexual services to the upper caste men who patronized the temple. The Devadasi had no choice in the sexual dimension of her role. She could not refuse patrons. She could not marry. Her children, inevitably stigmatized as children of the temple, had limited social prospects. Her own future, once youth and beauty had faded, was typically one of poverty and social marginality. Some Devadasis achieved genuine artistic distinction. The classical Indian dance form of Bharatanatyam is largely preserved because of the Devadas tradition, but the artistic achievement was extracted from a life that had been defined from childhood by the absence of choice. British colonial policy toward the Devadasi system was contradictory. The colonial state was simultaneously committed to non-interference in Indian religious practice for reasons of political pragmatism, and horrified by aspects of the system that it classified as immorality. The tension was not resolved until 1947 and the years following Indian independence, when state governments in South India passed legislation prohibiting the dedication of girls to temples. The legislation was imperfectly enforced, and the Devadasi system, or practices that closely resemble it, continues in some regions today. Debt bondage, the practice of pledging a person's labor as collateral for a debt, has been one of the most widespread and persistent forms of coerced labor in Indian history. For women, debt bondage typically operated through their families. A father's debt was repaid through a daughter's labor, often in conditions indistinguishable from slavery. The bonded labor system, Kamaya in Nepal, Halia in Odisha, Gathi in Andhra Pradesh, kept millions of people in effective slavery throughout the colonial period and well into the post-independence era. For women within bonded labor systems, the conditions of exploitation were compounded by sexual nurability. A bonded woman who worked in the landlord's household had no more protection against sexual violence than an enslaved woman in a Roman villa or an antebellum plantation. The debt that bound her to the household also bound her to whatever the landlord chose to demand. The children she bore in this situation were typically expected to assume their parents' debt, creating multi-generational bondage that trapped entire families across generations. Part 7, Abolition, Resistance, and Legacy, Chapter 17. Resistance. The woman who refused. Throughout all the slavery and female bondage described in this narration, there runs a countercurrent that demands acknowledgement: the resistance of the women themselves. This resistance took forms as varied as the systems that provoked it, and it was pursued at costs that are almost impossible to comprehend from a position of safety and freedom. The most dramatic form of resistance was armed revolt. Women participated in slave rebellions across the Americas, Africa, and the Caribbean. In the Haitian Revolution, women fought with weapons, supplied the revolutionary forces with food and information gathered through their work in planter households, and in some cases led military units. Senate Billet, a mixed-race woman who fought as a lieutenant in the Revolutionary Army alongside her husband, was captured and executed by French forces in 1802. She reportedly refused the blindfold offered to her before her execution. In the American South, enslaved women participated in the underground resistance networks that came to be known collectively as the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped enslaved woman, made 19 dangerous return trips into the South to lead approximately 70 enslaved people to freedom. She worked as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War, and the Combahee River Raid she helped plan and guide in 1863 freed approximately 700 enslaved people in a single arm. She was never captured. Less dramatic forms of resistance were practiced daily by enslavement across every stem of bondage. Working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, poisoning food, sabotaging crops. These were weapons of the powerless, used at constant risk of discovery and violent punishment. Enslaved women in the American South developed a tradition of herbal knowledge that included both healing remedies and abortifacients, plants that could induce miscarriage, used by women who refused to produce children for the slave system. The use of poison was both a form of resistance and a source of terror for slaveholders. In Brazil, the Quilombo communities included specialists in plant medicine whose knowledge could be turned to lethal purpose. In the Caribbean, enslaved women were frequently accused of poisoning, sometimes falsely, sometimes truthfully, their masters, their children, or other enslaved people who had served as informers. The fear of poison led to the development of elaborate regulatory systems in some Caribbean colonies, restricting enslaved people's access to certain plants and punishing herbalists with particular severity. Infanticide, the killing of newborn children, is the most morally complex and emotionally devastating form of resistance documented in the history of slavery. Enslaved women who killed their infants rather than allow them to be born into slavery were exercising the only form of protection available to them, a protection that destroyed what they were trying to protect. Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman in Kentucky who in 1856 killed her 2-year-old daughter rather than allow her to be returned to slavery after an attempted escape, became a national figure. Celebrated by abolitionists, condemned defenders of slavery, and later commemorated by Toni Morrison in the novel Beloved. Her act was a measure of the absolute desperation produced by a system with no exit. The psychological and cultural resistance practiced by enslaved women is harder to document, but no less significant. The preservation of African cultural practices, songs, stories, beliefs, healing traditions, within the conditions of American slavery was an act of resistance against a system that sought to destroy African identity completely. Enslaved women were primary carriers of this cultural knowledge, passing it to their children in the limited private spaces that slavery allowed. The spirituals that emerged from American plantation slavery. The greatest musical tradition America's were shaped by the voices and experiences of enslaved women as much as by enslaved men. Chapter 18, The Abolitionist Movement and the Voices of Enslaved Women. The abolition of slavery, the legal ending of the institution across different societies over the course of the 19th century, was one of the most significant moral revolutions in human history. It was driven by a combination of moral argument, economic change, and sustained political organizing. And within the abolitionist movement, the testimony of enslaved women played a specific and crucial role. The British abolition movement, which achieved its first major victory with the Slave Trade Act of 1807, and its more complete triumph with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, drew extensively on the accounts of formerly enslaved people to make the moral case against the institution. Mary Prince, born into slavery in Bermuda around 7788, became the first black woman to publish a narrative in Britain when her account appeared in Aden 1831. Her narrative described beatings, forced labor, and sexual humiliation with a directness that shocked readers who had preferred to understand slavery in Ab's terms. Her testimony before the Anti-Slavery Society helped build the parliamentary support for abolition. In the United States, the abolitionist movement developed a similar strategy of centering the voices of formerly enslaved people. Sojourner Truth, born into slavery in New York around 1797 and freed when New York abolished slavery in 1827, became one of the most powerful voices in both the abolitionist and women's rights movements. Her famous speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, in 1851, "Ain't I a Woman?" drew an explicit connection between the oppression of enslaved women and the broader oppression of all women, challenging an audience that included white women who did not always recognize their complicity in the stem of racial slavery. Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, was the most detailed account of the sexual dimensions of slavery written by an enslaved woman. Jacobs wrote under the pseudonym Linda Brent and described with precise specificity the years of sexual harassment she endured from her owner, the impossible choices she was forced to make, and the desperate strategy she employed, hiding in a tiny crawl space above her grandmother's house for 7 years to maintain some degree of control over her own life. Her narrative was initially doubted by some readers who found it too explicit to be believed. It has since been thoroughly authenticated and is recognized as one of the most important documents in the history of American slavery. The women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement developed in close relationship in the 19th century United States. partly because many of the women who became leaders in the fight for women's rights had their political educations in the abolitionist movement. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which launched the American women's suffrage movement, was organized by women who had spent years working in abolitionist organizations. The connections were not always comfortable. The movements were divided by racial tensions and by differing assessments of priority. But the intellectual and moral debt of the women's rights movement to the abolitionist cause, and to the testimony of enslaved women, is undeniable. Chapter 19, The Long Aftermath, Slavery's Echoes in the Modern World. The formal abolition of chattel slavery in the British Empire in 1833, in 1865, in Brazil in 1888, in the last remaining Ottoman territories in the early 20th century, did not end the exploitation of women through forced labor and sexual coercion. It transformed it, sometimes in ways that were immediately apparent, and sometimes in ways that took generations to become clear. In the American South, the end of legal slavery was followed almost immediately by the development of systems designed to reproduce slavery's economic effects through different legal mechanisms. Black codes, state laws passed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, restricted the movement and economic options of formerly enslaved people with the explicit intent of keeping them in agricultural labor on terms determined by white landowners. The convict leasing system, which emerged in the South after the Civil War and persisted into the 20th century, used criminal laws that were selectively enforced against black people to create a captive labor force that was leased to private businesses. Black women convicted of minor offenses could find themselves working in conditions that differed from slavery primarily in the absence of a permanent legal ownership relationship. Sharecropping, the system by which formerly enslaved families farmed land owned by white landowners in exchange for a share of the crop, with the costs, seed, and living expenses charged against their share, trapped black families in debt cycles that were functionally similar to the debt slavery, ancient Mesopotamia. Black women who worked as domestic servants in white households in the South after the Civil War did so for wages that were kept low by legal and social mechanisms that left them with few alternatives, and in conditions that preserved many of the characteristic features of the slavery system, including sexual vulnerability and the absence of effective legal recourse against violence. The global trafficking of women and girls, which is today recognized as a form of modern slavery, connects directly to the historical systems described in this narration. The forced movement of women from poor countries to wealthier ones for the purpose of sexual exploitation or domestic labor reproduces the structural features of the transatlantic slave trade and the Ottoman concubinage system. The vulnerability of economically marginalized women and girls, the profit motive of traffickers, and the complicity of systems of law enforcement that are indifferent or actively hostile to the victims. The United Nations estimates that approximately 43 million people are currently living in conditions of modern slavery worldwide. Of these, approximately 29 million are women and girls. The majority of female victims of modern slavery are found in forced sexual exploitation or forced labor in domestic service, the two roles that enslaved women have been forced into throughout recorded history. The geography has changed. The economics have changed. The fundamental dynamic has not. The comfort women of the Second World War, those who survived, organized and testified through the 1990s and 2000s, many of them into extreme old age, demanding formal acknowledgement of what had been done to them. In South Korea and the Philippines, in China, they gathered weekly in public protests, wearing holding banners, speaking to journalists and legislators and students about what they had endured when they were girls. Some achieved recognition, partial justice, and what they themselves acknowledged was inadequate compensation. Most did not. The Yazidi women kidnapped and enslaved by the Islamic State organization in 2014 in northern Iraq and Syria experienced a form of enslavement that the Islamic State itself explicitly framed in the theological language the early Islamic Caliphate, including the revival of specific categories from medieval slave law. Thousands of Yazidi women were abducted, sold in slave markets, and distributed among Islamic State fighters as sexual slaves. Some escaped. Many did not. The survivors who have spoken publicly, women like Nadia Murad, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018, have described experiences that go across 14 centuries, the enslaved women of the early Abbasid Caliphate. Chapter 20, Conclusion, Remembering what was refused. We have traveled far in this narration. We have moved from the cuneiform tablets of ancient Sumer to the Nobel Prize ceremony in Oslo. We have walked through slave markets in Athens and Baghdad and New Orleans and Constantinople and Pompeii. We have entered plantation fields in Louisiana and sugar mills in Barbados and comfort stations in Manchuria. We have witnessed, in historical record after historical record, the same fundamental act. The decision of a society or an institution or an individual to classify a woman as less than a person, and the consequences of that classification for every aspect of her existence. What has been described in this narration is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant to the present. The systems of female exploitation that developed over millennia did not vanish with the stroke of a legislative pen. They transformed, adapted, and in many cases, persisted. The economic logic that made female slaves profitable in ancient Rome, cheap domestic labor, sexual availability, reproductive capacity, is the same logic that drives contemporary trafficking operations. The social logic that made female exploitation invisible, the assumption that women's suffering is private, not public, personal, not political, regrettable perhaps, but not a crisis, is recognizable in the debates that continue today about how seriously to take violence against women. The women whose stories have been told here, and the far greater number whose stories we can never recover, because they left no the records that survived, deserve more than to be treated as historical examples. They were people. They had, before their capture or their birth into bondage, or the moment their community decided to sell them, full inner lives. Things they feared, things they loved, people they were attached to, a sense of themselves as subjects of their own experience rather than objects in someone else's. Economy. The historical record preserves, occasionally, a glimpse of this inner life, in a fragment of a letter scratched on papyrus by an enslaved woman in Palmyra, Egypt, asking a relative to send a particular piece of cloth. In the graffito scratched on the wall of a Pompeian brothel by a woman who wanted to record her own name. In the spirituals of the American plantation, music that encoded grief, defiance, and longing into forms that even those who imposed the bondage could not entirely silence. In the testimony of Harriet Jacobs, writing in the third person about her own suffering because the first person was too exposed. In the weekly protests of Korean comfort women outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, carrying photographs of themselves as girls before. These traces are not enough. They were never enough. But they are what we have, and they demand to be heard. The story of enslaved women is not a footnote to human history. It is a central chapter, one that illuminates the relationship between power and vulnerability, between economic systems and human bodies, between the stories societies tell about themselves and the realities they produce. To understand it fully is not to wallow in historical horror for its own sake. It is to see clearly, clearly enough, perhaps, to recognize the echoes that persist and to refuse to look away. This narration is dedicated to every woman whose name we do not know.